Don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these heterodox conversations for complexity. Hello there, and thank you for your ears and your attention. We're happy to have you. My name is Drew Perkins. I'm the director of Thought Stretchers Education, and I'm also the host of this podcast. Before we get to the content of this podcast episode, I wanted to share a few notes and updates. As always, we encourage you to go to wegrowteachers.com for our professional development services. And I'm pleased to announce that we now have thoughtstretchers.org, which is the landing page for the community that we've been threatening to launch for quite some time. It's been a painstakingly slow process, but we're getting closer and closer. What you'll find on thoughtstretchers.org is the foundational principles and concepts upon which we are looking to grow that community, as well as some places where you can sign up for the email newsletter, which will, of course, let you know when we do officially launch and any subsequent events and happenings. This is all meant to be an extension of our professional development work, and we have indeed begun working with schools on heterodoxy and helping them better understand the principles of liberal inquiry and equipping them with the tools to navigate some of these culture war kinds of issues. If you're interested in any of that, you can reach out to me at drew@thoughtstretchers.org.
Americans on opposite sides of the political spectrum don't just disagree on the issues. More and more, they can't stand one another. This partisan animosity is the crisis of our time and threatens our nation. Braver Angels is here to address this. Our mission is to bring Americans together to bridge the partisan divide and strengthen our democratic republic. But no single organization, no matter how successful, can be powerful enough all on its own to heal this divide. If our goal is really to strengthen our democratic republic, our only practical strategy is to ignite and shape a broader movement for civic renewal. That's why we started Braver Network. At Braver Network, you'll find organizations from all across the country and all across the political spectrum that even when they disagree on the issues, come together to spark this movement for civic renewal. In building this network, we commit to equal representation, not just between conservatives and liberals, independents and nonpartisan groups, but also between national and community-level organizations. At Braver Network, you'll find the whole gamut, from businesses and leadership organizations to educational and religious institutions, all committed to improving our politics and strengthening our nation. We're looking for leaders and members of all kinds of organizations who are ready to lead and take part in the movement. Joining is completely free, and the opportunities for collaboration are endless. Help turn the tides of toxic polarization. Check out braverangels.org to sign your organization up for Braver Network.
In this episode, I spoke with Olivia Krauth. Olivia is a journalist and up until about 3 months ago was the political and before that the education reporter for the Courier-Journal, which is the newspaper in Louisville, Kentucky, which is our home base. We talked a lot about the education work that she's done and the intersections with the political pieces that she's worked on and the undercurrents there. And one of the reasons that she is no longer working at the Courier-Journal is because she had some conflicts with her employer there about several things, but certainly including her idiosyncratic social media presence. While Olivia's work definitely focuses on Kentucky, it was interesting to sort of see behind the curtains a little bit on how the sausage is made and some of the things that she experiences as a journalist in both the education beat and the political beat, which I think certainly overlap in lots of important ways. One thing that I neglected to do was give her an opportunity to share links and places to find her. So if you want to follow her on Twitter, you can find her at Olivia Krauth. And her website is oliviakrauth.com. We'll put those links in the show notes, of course. As I've said many times, I think journalism is really important, and especially local journalism, which tends to be a little bit less narrative and a little bit more fact-based. And I'm sad to see Olivia not covering the education and politics beat here in Kentucky because she has done some really, really good work. Anyway, I know this is a more local to Kentucky kind of episode, but I certainly think there are some national implications, and I certainly hope you find it helpful. And here's my conversation with Olivia. All right, I'm here with Olivia Krauth, and Olivia has been on the podcast once before, I believe just once before. We were talking about, I think, the great piece that you had done when you were with the Courier-Journal on the busing in JCPS, Jefferson County Public Schools, but no longer with the Courier-Journal, and maybe we'll get into the details on that. But my goal here was to kind of get her to talk a little bit about the state of education reporting and the political and journalistic undercurrents as they are, and get her perspective on that. But I want to give you an opportunity to say hi, and maybe, I guess, give folks an update on who you are, where you are, and to the extent that you know where you're going.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's good to be back. I don't currently have like an identity. I feel like for so long, obviously the job title was just journalist, and over the last 3 months since I left the CJ, it's been a lot of soul searching and just kind of wandering around and trying to figure what I want to do next. So when I left the CJ, I think I'm best known in this kind of realm for my education reporting. But when I left, I had been covering politics. And so I've been kind of looking at stuff, next steps kind of in the government relations realm, still eyeing journalism, but I have like a very specific list of things that I would want in a journalism gig. And then I also have kind of done some like freelance data work because I've always been big on data. Got some social media influencing stuff for whatever reason going on. I know. But it's kind of just been like being self-employed and doing kind of whatever makes me happy in the moment.
Okay. Well, like you said, you left the Courier-Journal about 3 months ago, and I follow you on Twitter. I know you're on Twitter X, or X as it's known. I know you're on other places, and I've seen a few TikToks here and there, although I try to stay away from TikTok as much as possible. But always entertaining and certainly interesting. But I'm curious, and again, to the extent that you care to talk about it, I know you've tweeted about it, and people, I'm sure, have come at you. It seems like people have come at you with whatever kind of weird, I don't even know what one would call it, but to the extent that you want to talk about why you left, as my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that your employer was not comfortable with you making social media posts, I guess, outside of approved social media posts or something like that. Is that correct?
Yeah. I would say just very broadly, there were definitely several reasons that kind of, played roles in various sizes as to why I left. But the social media situation was definitely a big part of it. Essentially, I mean, you've followed me for years, and I've always kind of had like a very specific type of persona and personality, and not necessarily the normal type of just very straight news journalistic type of tweeter. And that's never been an issue until suddenly one day over the summer it was. And I started getting formally written up for things that I didn't realize were problems, things that I disagreed with their interpretation of, like, why it was a problem, and their projections and kind of assumptions on some things. And it turned into a situation where I felt like I could not fully and adequately do my job in the way that I had come to know it to be done best, essentially. And so that played a really big role. There were also some issues. I always had some issues with like not necessarily always feeling included on staff, but I think a lot of people over the course of my time there have felt that in different ways. I think it appears in different ways for different people. And there was a pretty serious like pay gap that I had learned about a year ago that was kind of something that they refused to fix in any way, shape, or form. And that just, ate away at me long enough. So
pay gap between yourself and another employee, and
kind of. Well, generally it was around the time where we were starting to really get super serious about unionizing, kind of heading down the home stretch there. And we started doing behind the scenes a little bit of a very informal pay study. And it was kind of quickly brought to my attention that I was not making kind of what I should be making for someone with my level of experience. I had just gotten back from EWA's conference where I was a finalist for the best education beat reporter in the country.
EWA is?
The Education Writers Association.
Okay.
So it's like my peers. So that was like a really big deal. It just didn't really make sense. And then we started looking at me versus all the other education reporters in the area, like my direct competitors. And then later kind of with the same with politics reporters. And there was a pretty serious gap between what I was making and I guess like the market value for the role.
Yeah, that's interesting. And one of the things that I think is relevant to talk about perhaps here is the revenue streams that media has, and, you know, the challenges and all those kinds of things. But I don't know what the pay structure is. Obviously, you would know more for journalists, but it strikes me as probably pretty stratified, that there's like some rock stars in I guess maybe national media being probably the most relevant there. And then you start to come down, and I don't know if I consider Courier-Journal as local journalism, even though Louisville's a pretty good sized city and covers some certainly statewide kinds of things. To, there on that level, journalists, especially at like tiny little newspapers, like they make almost nothing. And and it's really a challenge to, similar in some ways to teaching. It's like, how do you attract and retain really good people?
Yeah, I yes to like all of that. I think there were definitely people who, obviously, like I just said, that part of the reason I left was the pay. There were definitely other people who have left over the years because they found other journalism jobs, granted sometimes at bigger outlets, closer to home, bigger beats that they wanted, but often like just pay that we couldn't match or didn't want to match. So it definitely plays a role. And also it's a barrier to getting people into newsrooms, because it takes a certain type of person. If they start you out at $35K a year, like you can't really do too much with that.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, the social media piece, and again, as you mentioned, so your I guess feed, or whatever you want to call it, on the Twitters that I've seen is interesting and unique, and I don't know how you would characterize it, but sometimes a little combative, sometimes a little sassy's not quite the right word, but and sort of fun and poking fun, and then you do these TikToks, and it's like I've seen some of them, and it is unique, right? It's different by design, I'm sure. And what's odd is that, of course, free expression and free speech is a hallmark of journalism, right? And so that's a tension, right? What was the sort of the crux like? Were they worried that you were reflecting poorly on the institution, or saying things that were irrelevant, or all of, like, what was that about?
It was a little bit of all of it, kind of. I think there were some concerns about me reflecting poorly on myself as a journalist. A lot of the concerns were reflecting poorly on myself, specifically as a politics reporter. And they were trying to make the case at various times, like, politics reporters have to be held, especially like that close to a governor's race during the campaign season, have to be held to like a higher standard, which I don't disagree with. But at the same time, one of the things that they went after me for was I fact checked a common Republican talking point. And part of my, disciplinary form said very specifically, like, fact checking people online is not part of your job. And I'm like, but we had already fact checked that claim in writing. It had been published. if I can't go to the places where people are, TikTok, Twitter,
Mm-hmm.
and engage with them where they are, and also where the politicians are making those claims, it doesn't work in today's age. And I think that that's something, not just like my specific instance, but like newsrooms across the country are grappling with.
Yeah. So when you switched from the education beat to the politics beat, I don't know if you remember this, but I think I responded to one of the tweets that you announced that, and I was essentially saying like, there is no difference at this point, right? Like, come on, like how is that a different beat, right? So I'm curious what you found in, obviously there are some differences. So what were some of those big differences, and what was that shift like going from strictly education, which is certainly lots of big stories and lots of things to cover, especially in Jefferson County, Louisville, Kentucky, to politics, which is a bit more statewide, but certainly your education work was statewide as well.
Yeah. I think one of the big things for me was like education, while you can take it so many different ways, there are so many intersections with like housing and I guess like economic development kind of jobs types, all the kind of stuff. It's very narrow. It's kind of like, you're supposed to go to the school board meeting, you just like really have to kind of focus in, like at least in my situation, on JCPS, Kentucky Department of Education, and state education policy and politics. That's kind of it. But then when you go to politics, it's still the same thing. It's like, oh yeah, I covered politics. But that's it. You kind of have to be an expert in so many different things in order to give the kind of quality reporting that I was doing on the education beat, because I was an expert kind of in education.
Mm-hmm.
So now suddenly, yeah, sure, I was still an expert in education, but I had to become one in trans issues, medical marijuana, sports betting, all these random things, the budget, the tax like structure, and you never know what's going to come up what day. So that was really a major change. Of course, I had to go to Frankfurt every day during the session.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot more travel involved. And there is a lot more to cover for sure, but it can also, like, all that choice can be very overwhelming.
Yeah. Well, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, there's tons of things and complexities to both, but yeah, as you mentioned. So one of the overlaps that, and you kind of referred to it a little bit, so the trans issue, right? So that became a big piece in Kentucky politics, and the governor's race that was just decided, and Andy Beshear, the Democrat, won in a pretty red state, I would say. Although the governorship it's sort of schizophrenic. We often have Democratic governors here. Daniel Cameron ran, the Republican candidate ran with a lot of rhetoric against trans issues and things like that, and of course the education piece that's overlapping here, and I think is a real issue to sort of reckon with, is the use of pronouns and how we treat people and all those kinds of things, social justice kinds of things. And of course there's a dynamic that occurred. Our Commissioner of Education, Jason Glass, who is no longer our Commissioner of Education, I don't know, I guess it's fair to say, maybe you would disagree, that he was sort of run out of town by the Republican legislature. And so I'm curious, what's your take on that, and getting to see at least some of the sausage being made? How did that sort of play out from your perspective?
Yeah, I think first off, I think it's fair to say Jason Glass was kind of run out.
Mm-hmm.
I think he was definitely a fighter. And he stood his ground the whole time. But I think he was, in a way, kind of like myself leaving the CJ. Like, I could stay and always have to put up a fight, or I could go somewhere where I'm not going to have to fight, and I can do my job the way I think it needs to be done.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that. I think, yeah, the whole like trans rights issues, SB 150 was just it was a lot to cover, because it kept, if you may recall, like, it kept switching bills. And so they had like one bill that was just this one thing. And then they had this other bill that was just one thing. And so it was a really great lesson in really needing to be on top of your game as a politics reporter, because it's just like, you never know where something's going to go, and nothing's really dead until it's like legally like impossible for it to go through. And even then, some people would argue like it's not done until it's done.
Right.
So I think just that really was the story of the session. The largest protests of the entire, session were about those issues, those bills. So it really, I think I'm just thinking about it like almost reminiscing as a politics reporter, but like, it honestly, it was like really tough to cover, but it was really fun to cover because it was very fast paced. And there were a lot of, I got to know a lot of the advocates. And so it was just kind of my bread and butter type of deal.
Yeah. One of the things, of course, the at least a role, and I would say a major role of the media is to sort of do truth telling, right? It's like, how do you share the facts and what's actually going on? I would argue that there's been some shift, especially on the national level, towards a more narrative. There's a model of narrative journalism, like an MSNBC or Fox and those kinds of things, sort of, but being much more narrative. And I think less so at the local level, although you would certainly acknowledge that you have been accused of being with one tribe or another tribe, because to your credit, you mentioned calling out Republican talking point, and I think it was you that mentioned something about a Bashir talking point that was incorrect. I don't remember exactly what that fact was, and it's not particularly important other than it was incorrect. And, that's part of the job of journalists. And so one thing is from afar, looking at some of the work that you've done and others, and, just the sort of zeitgeist of media around stuff, Kentucky and not Kentucky, around some of these social justice kinds of issues, it strikes me that neither side, if you want to call it that, is being completely truthful. Like there's this sort of propaganda and messaging that is just sort of a crude way to fight against the messaging and propaganda of the other side, and they're all trying to sort of control the narrative and control the message. And as a reporter, how do you work through that process of trying to give the facts and tell the truth and not fall into that narrative to the extent that you're trying to, or trying not to?
Yeah, I think it comes down to what your focus is as a reporter. I think often when you think about political journalism, especially at a state or local level, you think about the both sides, like objectivity, like they said this, they said that, and then you decide. And that just doesn't fly anymore, especially in this day and age where if you do that and you go and tweet out a story, you will get attacked from both sides. And there is no one to defend you, because ultimately you're playing a role in like being wrong and allowing it to happen. So for me, it was always like focusing on the truth. And so, is this true? Is Bashir's like job stat, like, is that right? No, it's not. Okay, well, here's why. And then, okay, well, is this thing that the Republicans are saying about Bashir, is that true? No, it's not. Here's why. And just constantly having that mindset. I worked really hard to not repeat things on the politics beat covering the legislative session that I didn't know to personally have like vetted. And going back to that thing where it's kind of like you have to be an expert in all these different things, that came to be pretty hard to do. I could do it for like the trans rights stuff. I could do it for education, but the other stuff I wasn't as, well versed in. So that was it's a difficult thing. It's something you always have to keep in mind, and you really just like, you can't get lazy about it.
So when you think about media, the state of the media right now, like what do you think is going really well, or what's right about media at this point, and what are some of the things that are more problematic and troubling from your perspective?
Yeah, I think I think that we need to figure out the social media thing. I know we've talked about that pretty frequently today, but we have to do that because we need to get to our readers, because right now, we're not. And if we're going to really crack down on any possible thing that could possibly be seen as maybe possibly being even remotely opinionated and making people fear for their jobs, that's a problem. Because it's, if you want to engage an audience, you have to be online and you have to be conversational. You can't just be like a robot, and you can't be silent. And it's, so we really have to figure that out. I think in terms of good, I know last year there were a lot of fresh faces on the state capitol press beat. A lot of people are returning. I'm kind of like the only one who's like not for sure going to be there. But so I think a lot of them have gotten time to really get situated, have developed that kind of background knowledge and that sort of thing. And so I'm really excited to see what they do in a long session. I think a lot of them, we had a lot of, frankly, like a lot of old white guys kind of dominate the politics beat, and now it's a lot of young women. So I'm very excited to see what happens there. So I think that's an upside. That's
curious. Why do you think that shift has happened?
Well, quite frankly, they either died or they retired. And they needed somebody else.
Well, but they could be young males. I mean, why do you think the shift has gone to females? I'm curious about that.
Ooh, I don't know. I think part of it is just like we're qualified. Like I think about, the team at the Herald Leader. Austin Horn is a guy, but then Tessa Duvall, who had not covered politics, she stepped into the chief, bureau chief role, and so she got that because she's a very diligent reporter. She takes it very seriously, but she also, stands up for herself online. So I think that that's really important. And she's also like a 2-time Pulitzer finalist. So I think part of it is just like the people who applied for the jobs and were the top candidates, or people who I know with the Louisville Public Media, their Capitol reporter, Sylvia, she was just their breaking news reporter and they needed somebody to step up, and she stepped up and she did a great job. And so they put her in the role full time. So
no particular reason other than it just sort of, it may have happened that way. Yeah.
I would say so.
So you're making the bold claim that women are perhaps as good or even better than men at this job, which seems to, at least if I'm reading your social media feed correctly, that claim has been challenged in some ways, either behind the scenes and sometimes explicitly, right? So,
yeah.
I mean, you're still getting that, I'm assuming.
Yeah, I am honestly like the Twitter stuff has really died down, thankfully over time, as I got like more and more removed from actually covering day-to-day politics. And at this point too, I'm just like, I don't really care too much to like go on Twitter and risk like, people saying something. So I'm like not even saying too much at all at this point.
Right.
So it's kind of died down, but yeah, there was a long period of my life where I could say anything and I would get.
And that was not just online. Was it also in person? I mean, probably a little bit different because people don't come at you with the same vitriol in person for some obvious reasons.
Yeah. I mean, like there were always a handful of concerns about people almost like anonymous trolls online almost doxing me. There were times where they had said things where they had seen me at like a CJ event and like they knew what kind of car I drove and they knew like what I was wearing and that kind of stuff. But that hasn't really happened too much. But I do know like there are still times where I go out in public and people recognize me, and I don't know who they are, and that's always going to be weird for me. So we're getting there, but like, yeah, it's a lot more rare to be have anything mean said to me in public.
So covering the legislature and being in session and dealing with those politicians, which, there's certainly some good old boy kind of dynamics at play there. There's certainly some women in the Kentucky legislature, but I don't know what the breakdown is. Maybe I would assume it's quite a bit dominated by men.
It is, yeah.
I mean, did you experience that dynamic sort of in person and talking with them as well?
No, honestly, no, not really.
Oh, good.
I think they, mainly because there were so many new people. I know Damon Thayer was actually really good about it. I know a lot of people love to hate on him, but he was really good about like making us all feel welcome. It didn't feel like, he was only talking to the boys or whatever. Granted, of course, like you would have incidents with, Joe Sonka or somebody who's been on the beat for a lot longer and has sources already, like they would just get to kind of bypass and go straight to their sources, which, I have my own sources. And so like I could do that with different people. So it didn't really seem to play out. And I think for a lot of us, just our work spoke for itself. And so that earned a lot of respect from the men in charge.
Well, I guess that's a good thing. When you, because you've got such a, you're again seeing some of the sausage being made, and I see some of it in different ways. I certainly have my opinions on the state of education and the ways that we've moved forward and the things that get featured and the problems that we face. What's your sort of take on the state of education in the state of Kentucky, because that's what you'd be able to talk about, and the ways in which our policymakers, legislators, leaders, those kinds of folks that might be elected and some not, are affecting that either positively or negatively? Do you think it's going in the right direction, or are you more concerned?
I think right now it's always like we're heading into the session. The interim session where they meet and they just like learn about stuff and they don't yell at each other. That always causes me to have hope that things are heading in the right direction.
Until the cameras come on?
What's that?
Until the cameras come on?
Yeah, basically once that gavel goes down on the first day, it's like, oh, okay. Maybe hopes were a little misplaced. But I think right now, the main thing is like we really need to find something to do with the teacher shortage. And it is going to be a budget session, and they have, they said all last year that they're going to do some small things last year, but they're doing a lot of the bigger stuff this year because that's when the money is going to be handled. So it's not just like a thing that's kind of been said, once earlier this month. This is something that's been in the works for a while. So will it actually happen? We don't really know. But they have paid attention to the teacher shortage during the interim. So I guess generally I'm like optimistic for now. Of course, we still are dealing with like the impacts of COVID and all that kind of stuff. But for right now, I'm like cautiously optimistic.
One of my contentions and assertions is that policymakers, because they have lots to consider, there's lots of things that they ideally would be really smart about and know lots about, kind of like you're talking about going from education to politics and having to sort of level up in your understanding of all kinds of issues, right? And so they have those issues as well. Education is just one of them that, of course, I'm passionate about. But it strikes me, and has always sort of struck me, that the lawmakers at the state level and at the national level don't really have a deep understanding of I guess one way to put it is what education could be, right? That's often, reminds me of, if you recall, when the U.S. Congress was grilling Mark Zuckerberg or whoever it was, the big...
The TikTok guy.
Yeah, the media titans and all this stuff. And, it's like you could tell that these legislators, these old crusty senators, they had no idea how the internet even works, right? And so they're operating from this sort of position of ignorance. And I wouldn't say it's that extreme with education, but do you get a sense that the legislators and the policymakers do understand education really, really well, or not?
I would not say really well. There are definitely some folks who understand it pretty well. We have a decent amount of former school board members and superintendents, and we got an active teacher and active principal. So, and thankfully, a lot of those people have seats on the education committees. So they do have a good spot there. Of course, you're always going to have people who don't really understand what's going on. I think that's going to play, well, it has been playing a role in kind of the culture wars type of stuff, which has dominated the education legislation in recent years. I don't think you're going to see that kind of those level of remarks when it comes to talking about like the teacher shortage or something. But I did just remember that school choice is going to be like one of their top priorities.
Yeah.
So you're going to see some stuff there, and that'll be an interesting conversation. But I think we've had enough conversations as a state, or at least like journalists, lawmakers, about education opportunity accounts, vouchers, what have you, for them to be knowledgeable enough about what exactly is going on that front and what their bill would do or not.
Yeah, it's hard to tell, and to your point, there are definitely some that are educators, or actually some that are current educators, and or at least one that I know of, and some former educators. But it just strikes me, and maybe it's more about pedagogy. I mean, being on the school board gives you an understanding of the sort of turn the lights on, getting the buses, and some of the educational pieces, but not necessarily the pedagogy kinds of pieces. Do you anticipate that we're going to experience more culture war kind of nonsense in these spaces, or is it maybe dying down and going away some?
Maybe. There definitely is like still a very sizable contingent of lawmakers who are supportive of more drastic culture wars things. I don't know for sure. The only thing that's coming to mind is like maybe seeing the bill last year that would have prohibited drag shows from happening in certain places, seeing that come back. But outside of that, I think the focus, I guess, in terms of controversial, possibly education is probably going to be the school choice stuff.
Yeah. So we've touched on social media quite a bit, and obviously you've got lots of experience. Are you technically Gen Z, or what generation are you?
I think I'm technically what they call a zillennial.
That's
I'm like right on the cusp, because I'm 28, so I'm a 95 baby. Okay. Yeah, I think that's what it is.
Well, I'm just curious, like when you think about social media and the impact on your generation and how that has played out, like how would you describe that? Is it a net good, a net bad, especially with regards to mental health?
Oh gosh, I think that would definitely depend on whether or not like you are a true millennial, a zillennial, a true Gen Zer. Okay. Because I think I remember still growing up, like what it was like to have to fight to get a Facebook account. So I remember, a world without it. I think it definitely can have a pretty serious mental health impact, depending on how you use it, how much you use it. If you use it just constantly, like I think some Gen Zers are kind of known for, it definitely is going to have an impact. If you use it, quite frankly, kind of the way I use it, where you are doing a job, but you're you're out there in the public eye, and it's not always going to be great stuff that you get. That's going to be something. I think it's, I can't really say like, it definitely has positives. There are a lot of people who know what's going on in Kentucky, in the state house, in the school board meeting, like because of social media, that they would care otherwise, or they wouldn't have access to it. But again, I think it's not always great. I think it can be a place where media literacy can struggle to thrive, where there's a lot of people who just repeat things, and that's, just like, oh, that's my opinion. Well, no, your opinion is like factually inaccurate. Like, and then you have all the, it's just kind of like, that could be really bad. So I think it's kind of a mixed bag.
Well, one of the things that is certainly a shift in the revenue stream, as I understand it, is that it's less now about advertising and the revenue that comes from that, and it's more about subscriptions. And maybe that's different in different levels and different outlets, but I assume, and correct me if I'm wrong, that that's generally true. And there's sort of idea that we've got to get, because we're now more beholden to our subscribers and the people that are paying to see what we're putting out, that we've got to, one, put out things that they want to see and read, which gets into some of the narrative kinds of pieces. And that, two, there's always been a sort of dynamic of getting the scoop and getting the story, but now it's like supercharged, right? It's like the impulse of organizations, news organizations, reporters, what have you, to have to tweet something immediately. And sometimes those things are not factually correct. Sometimes they get fact-checked and pulled back. Sometimes they don't. And, that seems to be not the best model, and there's some bad downstream effects. So how do you think about those kinds of things?
Yeah, I think it's, honestly, as somebody who's spent the last 4 years like in a newsroom that's been trying to figure all that out, it goes back and forth kind of like between this idea of, okay, well, we know print advertising is declining. We need to find that money somewhere. We can do subscriptions, but like, how are we going to get those subscribers in? And then it turns into like, well, what about just providing quality, engaging journalism that would, that's kind of a model some of the time. And then some of the time they're like, wait, well, what if we just like kept, posting stuff and, even if it wasn't really newsworthy, or have you write a story and then rewrite it with a different headline and a different style, and have those be two different stories, so that people will click, and then there will be more page views, and then we can charge more for online advertising. And then it's like, well, how do we do that with like so few people on staff? And so it's just like, it's every time they would say one thing, it felt like it was about to go a different direction. And then, it's one of those things. I think with Twitter, I think, there are definitely chances that you will tweet something and it's wrong, or you'll miss a piece of context. I think people who, I guess, are in newsrooms who would be tweeting, during those situations have been around long enough, either as a reporter or as just a tweeter, like to know basically what I'm thinking about is like, in my lifetime, we've been through so many different school shootings, and there's always like, you always have to be like, this is a breaking situation. It's evolving, but we want to make sure you're aware that it's like happening in some capacity. Here's what we know. And I think in those situations, like Twitter threads, like live tweeting, like that can be very, very helpful. But yeah, it's definitely like a tricky thing some of the time.
Yeah. What do you think about the sort of shift to some folks to like going Substack and those kinds of newsletters and that dynamic? And have you considered that?
Yeah, I have. And and it's still a maybe. I'm still trying to figure out exactly what it is I want to do. But yeah, I think that that's it. Generally, it's like a good thing. But I think my understanding is like there are people who you have to have a really, really, really big audience in order for it to be like financially
Right.
worth it for you. I think I did the math based off of, some surveying of my readers and what I know about how much they would be willing to pay me or not, and then how much like Substack takes a cut.
Mm-hmm.
Like I would be looking at best, maybe an extra $600 a month, which would be nice to have, but also is like not at all, going to cover anything.
Right. And on top of that, that sort of removes the sort of financial structure where journalists have and organizations have relied upon, like a reporting bureau, or like the actual infrastructure, right? If you're running your own Substack, you don't have, for the most part, the resources to have all these people to be able to do the kind of work that it would take, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think you could easily like pair up with somebody and it would be like two of you or like a squad of people writing and reporting in this little thing. But I think one of the things that of course, yeah, you don't have like the resources in terms of, if there are floods in Eastern Kentucky,
Mm-hmm.
all of that would come out of my pocket to
Right.
like have to go out there. Like I wouldn't get reimbursed for mileage for going to Frankfurt, that kind of stuff.
Right.
A really big thing would be like editing. You wouldn't really have an editor unless you hired one for your little Substack project. And then like legally, just, what happens if you get sued, that's something you have to consider as well.
Yeah, yeah. Are there any models, or whether Substack or not, any, I guess, journalistic outfits, organizations that you think are doing a really great job, or that are models for the future that you really, I guess, admire or think are really good?
Yeah, I really do like the nonprofit model. So I think the problem is it's not always like super scalable. They tend to be really small teams, and therefore you have these issues of there are just things that you can't cover sometimes, or you don't have the resources to do big projects. But I would say like in Kentucky, the Kentucky Lantern started last year, and they do some really great work. That's a team of 3 plus an editor, and then some freelancers. Louisville Public Media, I think, is really strong as well. And they do have like the Kentucky Center for Investigative Reporting arm, so they can do that as well. And those are both not nonprofit. So I think that if you can make the nonprofit model work, that's probably the best way forward.
And why is that better? Why are they getting better results than, Courier-Journal or, New York Times or whatever?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's with the nonprofit thing, it's like if I have a reader who loves my work, like, and I worked at the CJ, financially, the only way they could support me is if they paid for a subscription to the CJ.
Right.
And that's like $10, $15 a month. But if that same person, if I was working for a nonprofit, they would be able to be like, you know what, Olivia's worth it to me. I'm going to donate $100 a month. And so you have people who are able to give more. And then it's also a lot easier to get these like multi-million-dollar grants or very serious, like, philanthropy efforts to really build this collection of money. So I think part of it's that, and part of it's honestly, it's like just like how they treat their employees and how they approach news is just, it's very, it's, I think, part of the CJ, and I know there are other outlets like this everywhere. So it's not necessarily like a CJ thing. They're stuck in kind of this very traditional view of the news, and they don't necessarily evolve as quickly as they need to, in a way that I think these smaller newsrooms are more, a little bit more nimble.
One of the things that I get a kick out of is when you, I guess, point out or maybe make fun of national journalists who come and stick their nose in Kentucky and report. And it is amusing because sometimes they make sort of wild assertions and have underlying assumptions that are a little bit odd that one wouldn't know if they weren't here on the ground. So that is kind of fun to watch, and I'm assuming you kind of enjoy it because at least it feels like it.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, I asked this on Twitter the other day and nobody said anything, which doesn't mean that there's not somebody out there, but is there a national education journalistic outlet that you think is doing really good work, and specifically education?
Okay.
And do we even need one? I mean, because education is pretty specific to states and local school boards and things like that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that there is room for a national look. I think because, the flip side of, education so local is like, you get so like focused on here and you don't notice like what's happening nationally if it's a larger trend, and like looking into that. So I will say on that front, they're not education specific, but the USA Today like education enterprise team was always really good about doing kind of those trend pieces, and bringing in from local reporters on the ground. Because I hate when people just kind of pop in from nowhere and they miss context. And, obviously I go after them online all the time for that. But I think USA Today was not doing that. And I think that's a really good thing. In terms of, honestly, there are so many of them that just like do good work. And I can't think of any that I don't like or any that I like more than another. So,
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, have you thought about, and maybe you've done some, I was going to ask you what the piece you're most proud of, and I'm assuming it's a $10 million ham piece, but maybe I'm wrong about that. But if I'm understanding correctly, you have always been a reporter, right? Not an opinion writer. And right. Do you ever have any, I guess, thoughts about shifting gears into something that's more opinion based?
Yeah, maybe. It depends kind of on what I do next. I don't like the idea of always needing to have an opinion on, or like being expected to have an opinion on everything. Like a situation where I would be a weekly columnist and I would always have to have some sort of column,
right?
Some sort of stand, even if I don't have one. So it's never really appealed to me a ton, honestly. Not ruling it out, but it may play a small role in whatever I do next. You could easily argue that like providing political analysis is, commentary.
Right, and some certainly have made that claim of your work.
Absolutely, yes.
And from both sides, right? Like I guess that's one of the questions that I'm curious to hear more, to the extent that you're willing to share, is how does that play out when you anger one tribe or the other, and you have angered one tribe and the other, and sometimes maybe both of them at the same time? What does that generally look like, other than some tweet storms or whatever? Does it go beyond that? Do they talk to you in person?
No, not really. Because I don't think I've ever done anything where it's like really made them so mad that they've like come up to me and yelled at me publicly. Actually, Kelly Craft did get very sassy with me when I finally showed up to an event and questioned her directly about dismantling the Kentucky Department of Education. And
I
I
invited
think,
her on the podcast here and she didn't come on, so
oh, Kelly, come
shocker.
on. Yeah.
She was too
But
busy
yeah,
hanging with Jack Harlow.
hey. That's true. I would say like typically it depends. There have been plenty of situations where they just like have, sparred with me online and then just not done
Yeah.
anything. Typically, if it's a Republican, like an anti-Republican type
Hmm.
of thing, I typically get a text or a call from Sean Southard, the Republican spokesperson, and he and I actually have been we've known each other since college, so we're comfortable enough to kind of be like, what is this? Like, not getting like very serious, like yelling. Um, on the Dem side, I don't really get that. There was one time, one a prominent politician, Democratic politician, like had his press team contact my editor because they were upset with how I um, accurately told them that I had basically written a story already and I was just asking for their comment, which is
Hmm.
completely normal
Right.
in journalism to do. So that was kind of weird. But typically it doesn't go past like
Yeah.
social media.
So what's your I guess maybe morning. I mean, my mornings I have a sort of routine of news consumption and journalism consumption and opinion piece consumption, that kind of thing. What is yours like? Do you have a sort of set routine? And what are those, if you want to share, like what are those outlets that you value and look at regularly?
Yeah, so right now I don't have anything. I honestly, I wake up and I kind of watch several hours worth of TikToks in bed, and then I get up by 2 p.m. or so. So yeah, um, yeah, I would say typically I just kind of follow whatever gets tweeted. I have my notifications on for a lot of the politics reporters still, and I'm not a big app person, so I only get push alerts for CJ articles. Um, so I do get newsletters from few different, like the daily roundups for a few different local outlets, and I'll go through those occasionally when I feel like it. But I guess I've turned into a much more casual news consumer than I was, and I think even as a journalist, I was pretty casual as a news consumer myself, like even then, which was, kind of abnormal.
Hmm.
I think journalists.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've tried some of them. I'm curious, maybe you've tried some of them too, or have thoughts about it. There's a few, I guess, sources that have tried to either aggregate different stories and show you, sort of both sides and different versions of that. I found those to be somewhat valuable, but like, I start to lose focus a little bit. And so my run through tends to be it includes CJ because I'm a subscriber, but maybe I shouldn't be anymore since you have parted ways and Manny McLaren has parted ways. But yeah, I try to look at sort of a sense of what's sort of left leaning and right leaning and some different versions of that. Lots of times just the headlines can tell you a lot, it seems to me, whether it's good or bad. And maybe I'm just wrong on that. But the problem, one of the problems is, I think, and maybe you disagree, is there's not a set of shared facts and truth at this point, and more so on the national level. And to the extent that you think that that's true or agree with that, how big a problem is that? And how do we, if it is a big problem, how do we get past that? How do we move back to something that's not necessarily objective, but is more, I guess, truth-telling?
Yeah, I think that that's definitely a reoccurring problem, especially on the politics beat, but you also saw it a lot on the education beat.
Mm-hmm.
It typically comes up around very, controversial issues, where even if there is actually a set of facts that is true, it's not, yeah, like you said, it's not shared.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a problem. And it's something that journalists always have to work around and figure out how to accurately, tell the story without getting themselves harassed sometimes, even though that's not ever really my top consideration when I'm, writing, or, accurately portraying the other side or anything like that. I honestly, I don't know how we get back to something better. So much of what we cover in politics, the stuff that people really care about, is just so charged, and everything is a fight, and nobody wants to, well, maybe not no one, like there are some people still out there who want to have actual conversations and learn and change and compromise. It's just kind of one of those things where, like, if you change your mind on something, you're seen as backtracking, and that's bad. And that, so it's like, it's not seen as growth. So I don't know what the answer is.
Well, that's maybe a good place to end, even as gloomy as it might be. I will say, being on TikTok and in your bed until 2 p.m. is probably not the mentally healthy spot I would recommend, but what do I know? Speaking of Gen, what'd you say? Next Zillennial, yeah. I don't even know what I am. I'm 54, so I don't know what I am. Don't really care. But anything that we didn't talk about that you definitely want to talk about, and if not, what is the piece that you're most proud of besides the $10 million ham piece?
I don't think I have anything else. So I'm thinking most proud of, I guess, seriously, it's probably one of the stories from the busing series. Probably the second one, the one like the did busing work one. But I also am a very serious fan of the Tale of Two Marty Polio story that they so graciously allowed me to write. Just focus on how there's JCPS Superintendent Marty Polio and apparently a distant cousin of his, a clean corporate comedian / juggler, also named Marty Polio. And they both live in Louisville. So it was a good time.
That was a funny one. Well, Olivia, I appreciate the time, and hopefully, as I always say, hopefully folks find it helpful. I'm always curious, or I will be curious, and I know folks in Kentucky for sure who are aware of your work will be curious to see where you land and what's next. I definitely appreciate the work that you've done at the Courier-Journal. People have complaints about all this and that and the other thing, and there's certainly some things that you and I probably disagree on and surely disagree on, but I think your work has really always been really good, and the Courier-Journal is definitely losing or has lost some quality work, and that is a shame because our journalism is not, as we've said, in a good place. So I appreciate that, and I appreciate the time.
Of course. Thank you so much.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.